Okay, I'm Bob Doyle, and I should start by saying this is my first philosophical lecture. So I've worked hard to get my wife Holly, who, like me, is also trained as a scientist. At Harvard, we both have PhDs in astrophysics. Most of my career has been involved in science and technology and development of entrepreneurial ideas through the years. I've been away from my academic career, but I've never left one part of my academic interests, which began in 1956 when I took a course in the philosophy of religion from Kurt Dukas, who was a colleague of William James in the time 1908, 1910 until his death, and like James, an experimenter with mescal and a few of the ways of getting new insights. I didn't go that path with the mescal or even many of the other drugs, and I didn't even inhale, but over the years I have developed a new way of working in philosophy, which is not analytic language philosophy, it's not the logical positivistic philosophy, all the behaviorism that put William James to sleep for 40 years or more, as we heard Trevor Roper quoted from Bob this morning. Instead, I always have been pursuing this alternative way of thinking about what's going on in the world as information structures. And as a cosmologist, I think I have things to say about how information was created in the world by something that, when I take a serious liberty and become a little back to Dukas and philosophy of religion, a kind of creative force in the universe, which is as close as a scientist will ever come to finding a providence, if not a personal God sort of thing. So I'll come back to that at the end of my talk, but I am an information philosopher. I hope to be more of a formal philosopher because now I'm in the astronomy department, but I hope this fall to be a visiting scholar in Harvard's philosophy department. So my website is a link. When you see a link in blue on my presentation slides, you click it, you go to my website, which has, at this moment, over 130 philosophers and over 60 scientists who've thought about 10 problems that I am working on. And the most important problem I'm working on is the one I'm going to talk to you about today, which is an idea I had to explain or bring up a plausible way of thinking about the problem of free will back in the 1960s. And over the years, I've found 11 other thinkers who think similarly to the way I think. But far and away, the most important of all of them, although there are some really great people in there, like Karl Popper, far and away the most important is William James, because he was the first to think what I'm about to tell you about. Now, why doesn't that go for me? I've got that on. There we go. To start off with, a short poll. How many of you think that science can find causal laws for everything someday? The neuroscientists will see into our brain and figure out exactly how we're working. A superintelligence would be able to predict all our futures. This is a philosophy in the free will world called determinism or compatibilism. How many of you basically would buy determinism? John is going to be solid with that. There's a hand waving. Okay. Then let's see if I can do this. How many of you think that you are fundamentally free and unpredictable, that we are the creative authors of our lives? This is generally called free willist or libertarian. And John, in the true dualist mode of operation... Compatibilist, we like to say. No. Compatibilist is in the first category. This is an unmitigated freedom I'm talking about at the second level, John, okay? In any case, that way I had 8 or 10 on the free will side and a few on the compatibilist side. So let me say, how many of you never answer questions in meetings like this? Just, yeah, good. I thought there were a lot of phenomenologists out there. Okay. Why William James? This is a 2,400-year-old problem. So why William James? 140 years ago, he simply asserted that his will was free. As his first act of freedom, he said, he chose to believe his will was free. In the diary entry, you've all read this in all the major biographers. They deal with this crisis in James' life, very down on himself, partly because everything seems so damn determined. How could he ever be anything different? How could he make a difference in the universe? I think that yesterday he wrote was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvilier's second essay, and I see no reason why his definition of free will, and we'll see whether Renouvier actually anticipated James, quote, the sustaining of a thought, because I choose to, when I might have other thoughts, need be the definition of an illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present, until next year, that it is no illusion. My first act of free will be to believe in free will. Here is the core of the man who thinks we have a will to believe. Okay? And I've got to learn to control this. Now, whereas James denied it to be an illusion at the get-go, today most books on free will deny that it exists. Now, these may be hard for you to see, but the most important of these books is the one by Harvard professor Daniel Wegner in the psychology department, who wrote the book called The Illusion of Conscious Will, in which he shows that we think we did it for reason A, but it turns out there were other reasons, B, etc., that were unknown to us. They were genetic, they were conditioned, hereditary, all these kinds of things. Other books like Living Without Free Will and Illusion by Saul Smolanski, The Non-Reality of Free Will, and the lights make it hard to read the slides. Did my neurons make me do it? That's where neuroscientists are going. And as a scientist myself, it's a rather appealing thought that I could be a scientist who could figure out how everything works. But actually, William James had already figured this out a long time before me. William James thought that an individual act of his will could make a difference in a causal and deterministic universe. He understood pretty well what physics was telling in those days, and yet he thought he could make a difference. That the strength of his belief in something like free will could actually make it, could increase the chance of their being true was perhaps wishful thinking, that my thoughts are going to convince you and everyone will be convinced, and is a relief. But James was not just a believer. He had an idea of how free will actually worked. He didn't develop this idea for another 15 or 20 years, but he began simply by believing in his freedom, okay? He had a model that was opposed to what he called hard and soft determinism, and famously entered into the taxonomy of all free will positions, some very famous positions. Compatibilism that John mentions there in the back was what James called soft determinism. But the harder form was really the one that was more honest. Because if you believed in determinism, if you believed physics of the day, Newton's laws, you believed that every single thing that happens in this room, including my hand motion, was determined at the beginning of time. The soft determinists also believe that, because they're also determinists, but they also believe that because the causal chain, the Aristotelian prime mover, that set it all going, or Newtonian clockwork, travels through a chain of effect, cause followed by effect, which is a cause for an effect, which is a cause for an effect, and it lands in my mind, and I just happen to be one of the little steps in the chain. And that's what they think of as freedom. It's a little bit like the freedom that Hegel described that a falling stone has, to fall freely, which of course is what we say under the force of gravity. Okay, today there are many hard and soft determinisms. My website deals with each of these. You see James' name, the modern name, and 3 other important positions, including illusionism, and those 130 philosophers I've written about occupy various of those boxes. Now, what's compatibilism? It was originally known as voluntarism, and Thomas Hobbes is the most important modern thinker. Chrysippus was the first Greek thinker to argue this position. And basically they were defining not freedom of will, but freedom of action. They wanted to be free of any external coercions. And so, although the will is determined, as long as the will is one of the causes in that great causal chain, that would be enough freedom for them. They found free will to be compatible, even with a complete predeterminism since the beginning of time. And William James is excellent at knowing the difference between determinism and predeterminism, as we will see. Hobbes said, quote, "The cause of the will is not the will itself, but something else, not in his own disposing. Voluntary actions have all of them necessary causes, and therefore are necessitated." For Hobbes, talk of free agents was nonsense, if free means uncaused and random. Hume said, and he's generally regarded as the leader of compatibilism in modern philosophy, "It is impossible to admit any medium betwixt chance and an absolute necessity." And we'll see how William James is going to get around that binary choice. He embraced chance. He said, quote, "The stronghold of the determinist argument is the antipathy to the idea of chance." And you must understand that for centuries chance has been regarded as atheistical, because if it is objective chance, it questions the omniscience of God. So it was never an easy thing to say, and James was an amazing thinker that he could go out on a limb and say, as soon as we begin to talk indeterminism to our friends, we find a number of them shaking their heads. This notion of alternative possibility, a link to my website on alternative possibility and the positions of a very large number of philosophers on that issue. They say this admission that any one of several things may come to pass is, after all, only a roundabout name for chance. And chance is something, the notion of which no sane mind can, for an instant, tolerate in the world. What is it, they ask, but bare-faced, crazy unreason, the negation of intelligibility and law. And if the slightest particle of it exists anywhere, what's to prevent the whole fabric, the whole connected causal fabric, from falling together, the stars from going out, and chaos from recommencing her topsy-turvy reign? James really understood the issue. Most people thought if there was anything really random, things fall apart. Now, just to see where indeterminism, his original word into the debate, is today. There are many, many positions, again. Agent causality under libertarianism, event causality, non-causality, and others. And again, there are philosophers in each of those positions. So let's get back. Why William James? He was the first thinker to enunciate clearly what I call a two-stage decision process, not a free will moment. If it's a single moment and it's got freedom in it, it's random. If it's a single moment and it's determined, we're not free. We need to break it apart, and James saw that it was two things and not one. James, and now these words that are italics are James' language in my sentence. So he says, a two-stage process with chance in a present time of random alternatives leading to a choice which grants consent, his phrase. We pay attention, we focus, and we give the one possibility our consent to one of those possibilities, and at that moment it transforms an equivocal, ambiguous future, his term, into an unalterable and simple past. The past goes beyond, we can't change that. There's the real determinism. Oh, so he had a temporal sequence of undetermined possibilities that, his phrase, present themselves. A very important phrase. They present themselves, followed by an adequately determined choice or a decision. And James saw a strong similarity between genetic evolution and his idea of evolution. But before I go on to Darwin, I just inserted a slide. Bob Richardson was kind enough to send me the comments that he's written on the essays, the most important of which, I told him, was the dilemma of determinism. And this is what Bob found in the dilemma of determinism, and shows me that he really understood William James. In the new book, and here's a little picture, sorry for the, can't see it in this room, it gives us, he said that James gives us a clever and hard to dislodge argument that in many, perhaps most of our life situations, we are free to choose between alternatives. And James, he says, attacks all forms of determinism, the philosophical, theological, the behavioral, or the genetic. And he says, again, we're quoting Bob here, accepting the possibility of chance does not mean accepting a world that is random, despite the thinking of centuries of philosophers and mathematicians and scientists. It instead means realizing that chance is another word for freedom.